Not the sort of thing you'd expect, the constable went on. Not in a place like that. He made a slight click of disapproval with his tongue. I don't know what things it's coming to. What with General Gordon killed by that there dervish, or whatever, in January, and now we got rapists loose in a place like Paragon Walk. Shocking, I call it. Poor young girl like that. Looks as innocent as a lamb, don't she? He stared down at her mournfully. Pitt turned round. Did you say raped? Yes, sir. Didn't they tell you that at the station? No, Forbes, they did not. Pitt was sharper than he meant to be, to cover the new misery. They just said murder. Oh, well, she's been murdered too, Forbes added reasonably. Poor creature. He sniffed. I suppose you'll be wanting to go to Paragon Walk now it's morning-like, and talk to all them people? Yes, Pitt agreed, turning to leave. There was nothing more he could do here. The means of death was obvious. A long, sharp-bladed knife, at least an inch broad. There was only one wound, which had to have been fatal. Right. Forbes followed him up the steps, his heavy feet loud on the stone. Outside, Pitt gulped at the summer air. The trees were in full leaf, and already, at 8 o'clock, it was warm. A hansom cab clopped by at the end of the road, and an errand boy whistled about his business. We'll walk, Pitt said, striding out, coat flapping, hat jammed on the top of his head. Forbes was obliged to trot to keep up with him, and long before they were at Paragon Walk, the constable was distressingly out of breath, and wishing fervently his duty had landed him with anybody but Pitt. Paragon Walk was a Regency road of great elegance, facing an open park with flower beds and ornamental trees. It curved gently for about 1,000 yards. This morning it looked white and silent in the sunlight, and there wasn't even a footman or gardener's boy to be seen. Word of the tragedy would have spread, of course. There would be huddles in kitchens and pantries, and embarrassed platitudes over the breakfast tables upstairs. Fanny Nash, Forbes said, catching his breath for the first time as Pitt stopped. Pardon? Fanny Nash, sir, Forbes repeated. That was her name. Oh, yes. The sense of loss returned for a moment. This time yesterday she would have been alive, behind one of those classic windows, probably deciding what to wear, telling her maid what to lay out for her, planning her day, whom to call on, what gossip to tell, what secrets to keep. It was the beginning of the London season. What dreams had crowded through her mind such a little while ago? Number 4, Forbes prompted at his elbow. Inwardly, Pitt cursed Forbes for his practicality, though he knew that was unfair. This was a foreign world to Forbes, stranger than the back streets of Paris or Bordeaux would have been. He was used to women in plain stuff dresses who worked from waking to sleeping, large families living in a few over-furnished rooms, with a smell of cooking everywhere, and the intimate usage of faults and pleasures. He couldn't think of these people as the same, under their silks and their rigid, stylized manners. Without the discipline of work, they'd invented the discipline of etiquette, and it had become just as ruthless a master. But Forbes couldn't be expected to understand that. As a policeman, Pitt knew it was customary for him to present himself at the tradesman's entrance, but he would not now begin something he had refused all his life. The footman who came to the front door was grim and stiff-faced. He stared at Pitt with unaffected dislike, although the superciliousness of the look was somewhat spoiled by the fact that Pitt was several inches taller. "Inspector Pitt, of the police," Pitt said soberly. "May I speak with Mr. and Mrs. Nash?" He assumed assent, and was about to go in, but the footman stood his ground. "Mr. Nash is not at home. I will see if Mrs. Nash will receive you," he said with distaste, then backed half a step. "You may wait in the hall." Pitt looked around him. The house was larger than it had appeared from outside. He could see a wide stairway with landings leading from it on either side, and there were half a dozen doors in the hall. He had learned something of art from working on the recovery of stolen goods, and he judged the pictures on the wall to be of considerable value, if too stylized for his own taste. He preferred the modern, more impressionistic school, with blurred lines, sky and water merging in a haze of light. But there was one portrait, after the manner of Burne-Jones, that caught his attention, not for its artist, but for its subject, a woman of exceptional beauty, proud, sensuous, and dazzling. Phew! Forbes let out his breath in amazement, and Pitt realized he hadn't been inside a house such as this before, except perhaps in the servants' hall. He was afraid Forbes's gaucheness would embarrass them both, and perhaps even handicap his questioning. "Forbes, why don't you go and see what you can learn from the servants?" he suggested. Perhaps a footman or a maid was out. People don't realize how much they notice. Forbes was torn. Part of him wanted to stay and examine this new world, not to be shut out of anything. But a larger part wanted to escape to the more familiar, and do something he was confident in. His hesitation was brief, and came to a natural end. "Right, sir. Yes, I'll do that. Might try some of the other houses, too. Like you say, never know what they've seen till you try, like." When the footman returned, he conducted Pitt into the morning room and left him. It was 5 minutes before Jessamine Nash appeared. Pitt knew her immediately. She was the woman from the portrait in the hall, with those wide, direct eyes, that mouth, that radiant hair, thick and soft as summer fields. She was dressed in black now, but it did nothing to dim her brilliance. She stood very straight, her chin high. "Good morning, Mr. Pitt. What is it you wish to ask me?" "Good morning, ma'am. I'm sorry to have to disturb you in such tragic circumstances." "I appreciate the necessity. You do not need to explain." She walked across the room with exquisite grace. She didn't sit, nor did she invite him to do so. "Naturally, you must discover what happened to Fanny, poor child." Her face froze for just an instant, stiff. "She was only a child, you know. Very innocent, very young." It was the same impression he had had, extreme youth. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Thank you." He had no idea from her voice whether she knew he meant it, or if she took it as a simple courtesy, the automatic thing to say. He would like to have assured her, but then she wouldn't care about the feelings of a policeman. "Tell me what happened." He looked at her back as she stood at the window. She was slender, shoulders delicately soft under the silk. Her voice, when it came, was expressionless, as though she were repeating something rehearsed. "I was at home yesterday evening. Fanny lived here with my husband and myself. She was my husband's half-sister, but I presume you know that. She was only 17. She was engaged to marry Algernon Vernon, but that wasn't to be for 3 years at least, when she became 20. Pitt didn't interrupt. He seldom interrupted. The slightest remarks that seemed irrelevant at the time could turn out to mean something, betraying a feeling, if nothing else. And he wanted to know all he could about Fanny Nash. He wanted to know how other people had seen her, what she had meant to them. "That may seem a long engagement," Jessamine was saying, "but Fanny was very young. She grew up alone, you see. My father-in-law married a second time. Fanny was 20 years younger than my husband. She seemed forever a child, not that she was simple." She hesitated, and he noticed that her long fingers were fiddling with a china figurine from the table, twisting it around and around. "Just," she fumbled for the word, "ingenuous, innocent." "And she was living here with you and your husband until her marriage?" "Yes." "Why was that?" She looked